Many people don't realize that our jails are full of people, around three-quarters of whom have been accused but not convicted of a crime and are presumed innocent. Even though most of them are not a threat to community safety, they remain in jail for weeks, months, or even years. Beyond the moral and constitutional implications of this, when they get out of jail, they are more likely to be rearrested for a new crime. And that's because when people are in jail, they can lose housing, jobs, and family support, and any mental health and substance use conditions they have can worsen, all of which are factors that drive crime. And meanwhile, people who do pose risks to community safety are often released. So, Matt, how did we get to a place where so many unconvicted people who are not a threat to community safety sit in jail unnecessarily? And at the other end of the spectrum, people who perhaps should be detained are not.
That's a great question. And I think fundamentally it comes down to the fact that we actually don't ask judges to make that decision directly. And that may come as a surprise. And in fact, I think it should come as a surprise. What happens in most jurisdictions is not that a judge is asked, does this person who stands before me pose significant risks to community safety or of flight, and therefore they need to be detained before trial? Or does this person not pose such risks and therefore they should be released? That would seem to be the logical question to ask a judge in that situation, but we're not asking that question. Instead, in most jurisdictions, judges answer the question, how much money should this person pay to get out of jail? Now, you could think of a case where someone's accused of something very serious like murder and their bond is set at, say, $5 million. And in those cases, it's probably pretty clear that the judge intends to detain a person, but that's really an outlier case. In most situations, for most charges, bonds are set at something like $500 or $5,000 or $50,000. Often that's based just on the charge that the person faces, which, as we will talk about later, doesn't necessarily equate to a good predictor of the risks they pose. But in those cases where the bond isn't $5 million, it's not really clear what the judge intended. Did the judge intend the person to stay in jail, or did the judge intend the person to be able to pay that bond and get out? And so the bottom line is, because our system typically relies so much on these financial conditions of release, otherwise known as money bond, we end up with those errors at both ends of the spectrum. People who don't have money simply because they're poor remain in jail, regardless of the risks or lack of risks they pose, and people who are able to pay their way out are able to get out of jail.
So money is often the deciding factor in pretrial release or detention. Can you explain what principles should govern pretrial detention?
Yes, and I always like to start when talking about this with what I think we can all agree on in broad strokes. So if we think about what our pretrial system should do, about what pretrial decisions should achieve, I think there are a couple things. First of all, those decisions need to be consistent with and uphold U.S. constitutional principles, like not depriving someone of property, liberty, or life without due process of law, like the presumption of innocence. So that's the first thing. They need to uphold constitutional principles. The second is that our pretrial system, like the rest of the criminal justice system, should protect community safety. So I think in broad strokes, we can agree on those two things. And I think a couple other very logical, common sense things flow from those principles. First is that there are some people who pose significant risks of flight or to public safety, and the only way to deal with them is to detain them before trial, right? That group of people exists. We might debate who is in it, how many of those people are, but there is a group of people who need to be detained. But then everyone else can safely be released, and in fact, they should be released. So that framework, I think, makes sense. And the good news is it's actually consistent with and reflected in the way the Supreme Court has interpreted U.S. constitutional law. In a 1987 case called U.S. versus Salerno, the court held that in our society, and this is a quote, liberty is the norm and detention before trial or without trial is the carefully limited exception. Right. So that really speaks to, in legal language, what I just said is there is a small group of people who need to be detained, and we can detain them, but the vast majority of people can and should safely be released.
What would it look like in practice for a system to follow these principles?
Well, in practice, I think the most important thing, there are really two most important things. The first is that judges actually make that decision that I was talking about earlier directly, this in or out decision. A judge should be deciding when a person comes before them, does this person need to be detained in order to protect community safety or prevent flight? If not, then they should be released, right? That decision should be made intentionally and directly by a judge. That is a hard decision to make, but that's why we have judges. The second thing is that that decision, like all legal decisions in a courtroom, should be based on clear legal criteria. Ideally, a state would have a mix often of constitutional law, statutory law, and perhaps court rules that set forth those criteria for detention, maybe based partly on the charge that someone is charged with, might mix in criminal history. But whatever it is, it sets forth clear eligibility that identifies the group of people who would be eligible to be detained before trial while they're still presumed innocent, while their case is still pending. Now, many states have some version of these eligibility criteria. Some of them are so narrow as to be kind of impracticable. But the idea here really is that this decision, like any other decision in a courtroom, should be made intentionally and based on clear legal criteria.
What does an effective pretrial detention hearing look like?
The most important thing about an effective detention hearing is that it be a separate hearing from someone's first appearance. In most jurisdictions right now, first appearance hearings tend to be fairly rushed. In many places, a judge only has a minute or two to make these critical decisions about someone's release. When we're talking about detention, someone's freedom is at stake. And so more due process protections come into play. And so a separate hearing should be held for a judge to make that in or out decision. So there are a few elements of an effective pretrial detention hearing. The first is that it still needs to be timely. It may not happen the morning after someone is arrested, but generally speaking, it should happen within a week of someone's arrest, because during that time, they are sitting behind bars. The second is that the person needs to be represented by counsel at a detention hearing. Now, ideally, someone would also be represented by counsel at a first appearance hearing, but representation is particularly important at a detention hearing because someone's freedom is on the line. The third is that a judge should still operate with a presumption of release at a detention hearing. That is, the baseline should be that this person will be released before trial. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone will, in fact, be released. It just means that it is the state's burden to show to the judge, usually by clear and convincing evidence, that this person's detention is necessary because of a risk of flight or because of a risk to public safety. So just like with everything else in the criminal justice system, the state bears the burden of proof. It bears the burden of persuasion. It is not the person's responsibility, the person's burden to demonstrate that they can safely be released. It's the state's burden, the prosecution's burden to demonstrate that detention is necessary. These decisions should also be made transparently based on clear legal criteria and on the record. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about a judge making a direct and intentional decision. The judge should say whether or not the person is detained, will be ordered to be detained, and provide the reasons why. This is consistent with what judges do in almost any other legal circumstance. They apply legal criteria to a case. They explain their decisions. Those decisions are on the record. And finally, that decision should be appealable, right? Just as when someone is convicted or sentenced, they have a right to appeal. If someone is ordered to be detained before trial, they should have a right to appeal that ruling. Likewise, if the state believes someone should be detained and they are not, the state would have a right to appeal as well.
Are there places that are using pretrial detention hearings? And has there been a move towards greater use of them more broadly?
Yes, there are places that use intentional detention hearings. In fact, this is not a new idea. Detention hearings, designated hearings where detention and release are decided, have been used in the federal system for a long time and in Washington, D.C. There are also an increasing number of states that are moving in that direction or adopting that model entirely. New Jersey in 2017 and Illinois in 2023 adopted pretrial detention hearings as part of a broader set of reforms aimed at making their pretrial systems more fair and effective. So that is definitely a trend in states. Now, often that requires substantial legal change. Sometimes it requires a constitutional amendment to change or establish criteria for who is eligible for detention. Sometimes it requires statutory change or court rule change as well that sets forth the way a detention hearing might be held. So in many states, it does require something more than just changing local practices, but that is definitely the direction in which the field is moving. And I think for good reason, right? As we saw before, it's consistent with constitutional principles. It helps achieve the goals that we have for our pretrial system. And it's just a more logical, sensible, common sense way to make these decisions. So there is movement in that direction. Even in states where they have not made changes at the scale or of the type that New Jersey and Illinois have moved, there are ways for local jurisdictions to move in that direction, to make these decisions be more intentional, even if they don't have a detention hearing system set forth in Constitution or in statute. And that involves a couple things. One is just being intentional about the use of money. So if you're going to, as a judge, set a financial condition of release, don't use those conditions on people you don't want detained. So many people in the criminal legal system are indigent or poor, do not have access to even what would normally be seen as modest amounts of money. So the use of money on anyone who a judge does not intend to detain is kind of a risky proposition, because that person could end up sitting behind bars until their case is adjudicated. So really, not using money in that way, I think, is an important move that can be made even just on the local or even in just a judge by judge level. The second thing, and this just echoes what I said earlier, is for judges to be very intentional when they are detaining someone, whether that detention is achieved through an order of detention or whether that is achieved through setting a condition of release, for instance, a financial bond that the person is unlikely to be able to meet. A judge should be really thinking through, do I want this person to be detained? Is it legal? Has the state met its burden in order to demonstrate the necessity of detention? And in that way, make sure that those decisions are intentional. And I think whether you do it through a detention hearing system, whether a state is engaged in broad legislative or constitutional reform, or whether these modifications are made on a local level, the idea is for us to use detention in the way it was intended, in the way the Constitution mandates, which is, yes, there are cases in which it needs to be used, but we need to be very careful and intentional about who is detained. And for everyone else, consistent with their constitutional rights, they should be released.